Kokila is a community worker and a researcher at Beyond Social Services, and she used to be a community engagement manager at Aware, right? Thank you, Kokila.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I was a 19-year-old uni student when I first found out about Operation Spectrum and Operation Cold Store. I'd come across an interview on YouTube, an episode of SDP's Let's Talk with an ex-detainee. It was late at night, and it was down the rabbit hole from there. I stayed up all night watching video after video, reading article after article, and my world was unraveling. It was my political awakening, and it was life-changing. I started writing to activists I found on the internet and asked to have coffee. I started working at an advocacy group right out of university. I stayed in Singapore when my plan all along had been to get out as soon as I could. The ground under my feet slipped that night when I realized that everything I'd been told about my country was a lie, but I also found my footing. I was outraged, but I was also thrilled that there was a place and a fight for me here. There was finally a narrative and characters that I could relate to. You know, once the fierce spirit of people like Said Zahari, Francis Seow, and Teo So Lang entered my consciousness, Singapore wasn't so dull. I'd wanted to leave to India because I was inspired by people's movements there, but now there were stories right at home that moved me. Having grown up in Singapore feeling thoroughly alienated, I was suddenly excited by this city and its stories. I had a fire in my belly because others had fought for me to have a fairer society to live in, and I had the shoulders of giants to stand on. I was born in 1988, the year after Operation Spectrum. I grew up in a society that was recoiling from the trauma of caring, fighting, thinking, and dreaming. I grew up with vague cautionary tales of how we should toe lines, keep our heads down, and not look for trouble. My coming of age in the 1990s was devoid of politically engaged student unions, workers' strikes, or visible subcultures. Most unforgivable, perhaps, was the depoliticization of education and the deceit in the monolithic stories we were told about who we are and where we come from. One of the most effective projects of the PAP has been to fabricate a history that erases powerful legacies of struggle and dissent. The cost is that contemporary social movements in Singapore are amputated from their predecessors, their strategies, their truths, their pulse. How far can we go when we've been forced to forget where we started? How do we enliven political consciousness without excavating history? If there's no identity without memory, there can be no movement without legacy. But it isn't just anti-death penalty campaigners or migrant workers' rights groups that suffer from this loss. It's social workers, students, journalists, lawyers, artists. Our cultures and institutions, by and large, have been robbed of the courage to be critical of power or the wisdom to be suspicious of authority. Fearless ideas are rare, radical efforts are mocked, and those who demand change are desperately lonely. My belief is that as a society, the price we've paid is even higher than we can fathom. Suppressing dissent kills diverse and creative solutions to social and economic challenges. And when we're not allowed to explore different ways of being in the world, we bear an intangible spiritual cost too. Perhaps more cruel than suffering a grave injustice is for that injustice to go unseen and unheard. It was and still is heartbreaking to me that while many victims and survivors of political oppression around the world are honored and celebrated, here they are largely invisible. To me, it is extremely valuable that we tell and retell these stories in quiet coffee shop conversations, that we shout them through loud hailers, write them down in books, perform them on stage, and inhabit them in our lives. We can together reclaim our social memory. Every time I've had a conversation with one of the ex-detainees, I'm amazed at how much there is to learn from them and their work, how relevant their experiences are to community organizing today in Singapore. Often people ask them about their time in detention and how they've rebuilt their lives since. Beyond that, I'm thirsty for the stories of what they were doing before they were detained and how I can build on that. How did they organize themselves pre-Facebook? What were the powers the student unions had then, and what lessons does it have for student unions today? How did the Geylang Catholic Center become a focal point in their work? What's happened to institutions like that today? What were they reading? What did they care about, and what made them cry? I read somewhere that the burden of truth-telling has never fallen on the state, the police, or the media. It has always fallen on the people, and largely marginalized people. To be in community with each other, for all of us in this room today, to show up in solidarity is to me a really powerful act that affirms our truths. And this is the meaning that being here today has for me. So thank you for having me.